Anil, I thought as we're going to have such a grand conversation about consciousness, we could start with something fun. Now, I've seen you do this on your TED Talk and obviously in your book as well. You've got these sort of, I don't know how you describe them, illusions or brain tricks, but this one caught my eye, literally. The twisting snakes, is that
Oh,
what
yeah,
it's
yeah,
called?
yeah, the rotating snakes.
Rotating snakes,
Yes.
yeah. So just for the listeners of the pod, what I'm looking at is a collection of circles with intersecting oblong shapes. And even though I know that this is a 2D image and it is static, it looks to me like there are rotating circles. What on earth is going on here? What on earth is going on here?
Well, you're right. It's an illusion. That's the way I like to call it anyway. It's a pretty classic one from a Japanese researcher.
Okay.
And what's happening here? It's playing with a basic property of how our eyes are organized and how our visual brain is organized. Like, it's very easy to think that we just see things exactly as they are. And if something is moving, we'll see it as moving. And if it's not moving, we won't. But everything we experience is really the brain's kind of best guess about what's going on. And that includes movement too. So what's happening in this illusion is that there's kind of lots of edges, lots of little contrast between these colored oblongs. And what happens is when we look at it in the right way, which is just to say, just put it in front of you and move your eyes around a bit, it generates all these transients in the brain. The brain sort of, whenever there's this contrast between the colors, something kind of fires off in the brain, and the brain infers that there's movement happening there. But at the same time, as you said, there isn't, and nothing else is signifying movement. So we have this very strange experience of sort of seeing what we see as a static image, but also there's the sensation of movement kind of superimposed on top of it.
Yeah. And it's quite disconcerting when you see it, because even with the knowledge that I know that this is static, it still continues to move. So it's almost like my brain is programmed to see this as moving, and I can't rationally override it. Am I right in saying that?
That's exactly right. I mean, there's this very jargony term psychologists use called cognitive impenetrability, which is far too long, but it just means exactly what you said.
Yeah.
There are some illusions that even if you know what's going on, you still can't help seeing it as an illusion. Knowledge doesn't override perception in that way.
Yeah.
So that's true for some things. It's not true for other things. But for basic low-level visual illusions that have to do with color and movement and shape and length and things like that, these tend to override thought and cognition. So we're just condemned to see these things the way we do.
Yeah. And is this something distinct to our visual system? So this cognitive impenetrability that you mentioned there, is it something that we only see really with our eyes, or are there in other domains of let's say smell or touch, texture?
I think it's likely in all domains.
Okay.
It's certainly true in sound. It's probably true in touch, taste, smell, all the other senses that we have. It's just a little easier to demonstrate with vision, which is why we have all these books of optical illusions.
Yeah. Okay, on the subject of other optical illusions, this one is particularly not troublesome for me, but it's really irritating, because in the knowledge of what I now know is true, I still can't unsee it. So this is this Addison's
Adelson's checkerboard.
Addison's checkerboard, yeah. And so again, just for the listeners, what I'm looking at is a 3D chessboard or checkerboard with a cylindrical object to the sort of top right side, and it's casting what I see as a shadow, and there are two pieces that seem to be different colors, but perhaps you could sort of explain what's going on there.
Yeah, this is another great one. And it's a great one because it always works. And it is also impenetrable in the same sense. I mean, I've seen this thousands of times, and it's still as striking to me now as it was the first time I saw it. So yes, what we have is this checkerboard with dark gray and light gray patches, and this green cylinder casting a shadow. And when we look at it, there are two patches which are marked, which just look different shades of gray. I mean, they do to me now. One is light, one is dark. But if you took away all the surrounding context, the rest of the checkerboard, the cylinder, you'd see that these two patches are exactly the same. They are the same luminance, the same color. But you put the context back and they're all different again. And I think this, to me, it reveals that what we experience is this construction. So it's not just the brain takes sensory information from the world or from a particular part of the eye and says, okay, this is gray or green or red, and so that's what I'll see in that particular location. The brain is always trying to infer what's going on overall, using all the information it can.
Yeah.
And deep inside your brain, inside my brain, inside everybody's brain, is knowledge that we may not be aware that our brain has, that objects under shadow appear darker than they really are. I mean, it sounds trivial to say, but it's a pretty profound fact of how light and shade work. Now, our brain knows this. And it also knows that in a checkerboard, basically things tend to alternate. You have light, dark, light, dark, light, dark. So you put these things together and the brain reaches the conclusion that the patch B must be actually lighter than it really is in terms of its own luminance, because it's under shadow and it's part of a checkerboard in the right place. So we see B as lighter than A. These are the two patches, A and B. But you take away that context and then the brain doesn't have anything else to go on. So our experience of the lightness or darkness is just directly now related to what's actually on the page.
Yeah.
Now, the key thing for me is that it's really fun to look at these illusions. I mean, they're great fun to play with.
Yeah.
But we make a mistake if we think, okay, that was just an illusion. And when we put the book away, we see the world as it is. I think these illusions are not only fun, but also a beautiful window into how our experience works all the time.
Yeah.
You know, our brain is always constructing our experience using everything it can get hold of and all the prior knowledge and beliefs and expectations that it has, from millions of years of evolution to where you grew up to what you did this morning. All of this stuff comes together to generate this beautifully rich experience of the world around us. It's not to be taken for granted. It's not a given. It's this kind of neuronal fantasy that coincides with reality, but is not the same thing as reality.
Yeah, and I totally get that, and I think the way you've eloquently contextualized it gives me reason to think about how I need to almost question not only what I see, but also how that infers thought and reaction in my day-to-day life. Like, driving to work every day, like simple things like how this can affect my mood throughout the day and how this ultimately affects my health and well-being. And I think, regular listeners to the podcast might be asking themselves, okay, I get this, I understand the illusions, I understand how this is affecting my perception, but why should we actually care about consciousness as it pertains to living a healthy and fulfilling life? I'm sure you get asked this a lot, people questioning why you decide to even research consciousness.
Well, it's something I ask myself as well.
Yeah.
Where have I spent so many years thinking about this, working on it from a background in neuroscience and so on? Because if it didn't make a difference to people's lives, to my own life, it would be a bit strange. I think there's a very simple answer. And the simple answer is that consciousness, our ability to have experiences, to be more than just objects, that's really everything that matters to us. Unless we consciously experience something, it doesn't matter. We would just be complicated objects whirling around in the subjective dark. And that simple fact, that consciousness is what makes life worth living, underpins everything else. So that's a very basic reason we should be interested in it. Within that, there's of course within that, there's how we might strive, or perhaps striving is the wrong word, but how we might wish to have a life that is satisfying, increase, enhance, maximize well-being. And here, I think the study of consciousness can be useful in very specific ways too. One way we've already touched on, which is understanding more about how perception works, helps us recognize this gap between how things seem and how they are. You mentioned driving to work in the morning or going about your daily routine. We tend to become a little bit automatic in our daily rhythms. This can be good, but it can also be distressing sometimes if our emotional state is not so good. And recognizing that our emotional response to a situation, our perceptual response to a situation is not inevitable, opens up a little gap that I think we can work with. In a sense, it's a bit like meditation. Meditation, for those people who do it in a very disciplined way, which is not me, will say that one of the outcomes is that you recognize that the thoughts you have, the emotions you feel, are just that. They are thoughts, they are emotions, they can be reacted to like clouds passing in the sky. You don't have to buy into the picture of the world that they paint. And the study of consciousness can get you to a similar place by a different route. It just, certainly for me, I think in my life, it's allowed me to step back a few times and just recognize, have a reflex to my reflex, if you like. So the first reflex might be to feel in a particular way, but the second reflex now is to recognize that that feeling is itself a construction. And that it will come and go. It will be transient. It's useful information, but it is not the be all and end all.
I think, so I'm someone who meditates most days. I wouldn't say I'm an expert meditator, but I try my hardest. And what you said there about thoughts, it really does resonate with me. And I think whenever I sit down and I stay in silence for about 10 minutes every morning as part of my routine, I constantly have to remind myself that whilst my thoughts exist and they whirl around my head and they are shaped by lots of external inputs that are outside of my control, I am not my thoughts. My thoughts are separate to me. And me, whatever that might be, is separate to that. I understand that at a very sort of basic level. What I was going to ask there is, do you feel the study of consciousness can almost be a parallel to meditation in a way that makes us more harmonious with our thoughts in our day-to-day and our mindset, and how we become healthier, happier beings?
I think it can be. I'm also I'm much less diligent meditator than you. I've dabbled, and it's not really the kind of thing that dabbling gets you very far in. But yes, both the study of consciousness and meditation, well, they relate in many ways. I mean, one super interesting way is that meditation brings about a fairly characteristic state of consciousness. So there's an interest there. So what's happening in the brain when people are meditating? What distinguishes that as a state of consciousness? And the emerging story there is it seems to have a lot to do with the control of attention. And I think that's, at least in the meditation that I've done, it tends to be about noticing what your attention is doing and bringing it back. And in daily life, we tend not to notice what our attention is doing. It can be very scattered. It can be focused on counterproductive things. So learning how to control one's attention, I think, can be very, very helpful. But there is this more fundamental relationship as well. And it comes down to what you were saying about the self. You recognize that the thoughts that go through your mind are not identical with you, whatever you is. The emotions you feel are not identical to you, whatever you is. The urges and intentions you feel, the same thing. So this raises the question, well, what's left? If all of these things are not you, then what remains that is? And it may be, and I think this is where my work in neuroscience and psychology and philosophy has gone over the years, is that there is no essence that is any of us. This sense that there is an unchanging, stable me-ness or you-ness, well, that too is a kind of illusion, in much the same way that the visual illusions we started with are illusions. They're perceptions. They don't directly reflect how things are. Now, the experience of being a self, we tend to think of the self as the recipient of all these perceptions of the world. We experience the world, we have an emotional response to it, we decide what to do, we think about it. But all of these aspects of self, emotion, thought, they're also kinds of perceptions. They're things the brain does. And I think that what we experience as the self is just the whole collection of all these things going on. The emotions, the thoughts, the intentions, the body, the sense of this object here is my body. I'm holding my hand up in front of me. This table is not. All of these things together collectively characterize what the experience of being a human self is like. And there is no residue beyond that. Of course, meditation teachers and especially spiritual writers and thinkers in Buddhism have been saying this for ages, right? That this idea that there is a stable, permanent you-ness or me-ness is part of the way the world presents itself. It's an illusion too. Doesn't mean it's not important, but it does tell us that things change, there's an impermanency, there's a transience, and that need not be disorienting. That can be very liberating, it can be very illuminating, it can be very good for us.
Just a quick one. If you're enjoying this kind of content, you will love our free newsletter called Seasonal Sundays. It goes into depth on a seasonal ingredient every Sunday, and we talk about the nutritional medicine benefits, the research, and the culinary uses of an ingredient every Sunday with recipes included. You can get access to the free newsletter in the link just down below. Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned there philosophers and spiritual teachers of years and years ago. I wonder if there's a parallel with your work. So whenever I look at something within nutrition, particularly let's say gut health right now, and there is a huge explosion of interest in gut health since the sequencing of microbiotas, how we now understand that bacteria are neither good nor bad, they just are. And actually 99% of the bugs that live in and around our body are actually doing us good rather than harm, which is in stark contrast to the sort of germ theory that has dominated the way we thought about food and medicine. And when you go back far enough, you actually see a lot of teachers of ancient medicine talking about how the route to health is through the gut. And there's a lot of things that we're now discovering and looking at through the lens of modern science that have been talked about for millennia. And not to say that everything that has been practiced or thought of in the past has been true, but it's just an interesting quirk of sort of straddling both sides of the fence, looking at both ancient medicine and ancient traditions around nutrition and what modern nutrition science is telling us today. Do you sort of see parallels within your work? Because, in your lab, you're collaborating with philosophers, neuroscientists like yourself, mathematicians, and what you've just mentioned there about ancient spiritual teachers and what they've also been talking about with regards to consciousness. Do you see quite an overlap there, or do you see it differently?
Yeah, there is a synergy, and this has been something that's been going on for quite a long time, especially with Buddhism, actually. There's been I think within the field of Western philosophy and neuroscience, the interaction with Buddhism has been particularly productive because there's been an openness there. So it's not that Buddhist scholars typically will say, we already have all the answers, you guys are just fumbling around in the dark. There's an actual dialogue, and it's a very enriching dialogue, in part because one of the things that has happened over the last 100 years in Western science philosophy is the emergence of a relatively impoverished view about what consciousness can be. And we tend to associate it just with rational thinking. That was Descartes some hundreds of years ago. And even now, most people in my field focus on visual experience. You put an image in front of someone, as we did with these illusions, you see what happens in the brain, you see what they see. It's very experimentally accessible. But it is just one part of what being conscious is all about. And you only get so far looking for the car keys where the light is. You need to expand the region of conscious experiences that you look at. And this synergy between Buddhism and neuroscience, I think, has been really productive there. It could happen with other spiritual traditions too. I think there's a lot to learn from many of them. But the dialogue has to unfold in the right way. And if it becomes sort of adversarial, like who's right, then I don't think you get very far.
Yeah. And is there a description that you've come across, perhaps from Buddhist philosophy, that you feel really does encompass what we know today about consciousness and how we would go about defining it, even if that's sort of possible in a sentence or two?
Definitions are always really, really tough.
Yeah.
They tend to be fairly self-referential within each tradition.
Sure,
I mean, my family background, like you probably, is from India.
Yeah.
And whenever I speak to Hindu scholars, there's this beautiful, poetic, but kind of inevitable circularity for defining what consciousness might be. But again, I think there's a lot in common between Hinduism and Buddhism here. And I think rather than a specific definition, there are themes which keep resurfacing, which I think are very meaningful. One of them is this concept of Maya, the manifest world as being somewhat illusory, but not arbitrary, just indirectly related to reality as it is. And this has precedence in Western philosophy as well, with Immanuel Kant and his idea that there is a real world out there, but we can never have direct access to it. What's added here is that applies also to the we, to the I, to the you, to the self. That's something that is part of an ongoing flow of experience, not something that's set apart from it. And I think that's the other emerging theme, is the nature of the self. What is the self?
Yeah.
Is it a thing? Is it an essence? Is it a process? And of course, there are differences too. I think one of the major differences lies in what happens after we die.
Yeah.
And here we see quite stark contrast between there being a continuity of some sort, which many spiritual traditions maintain, and the story from neuroscience, which can be a bit starker, which is basically when your brain stops, you stop.
Yeah. Is that something? I know we're mixing belief, I guess, and tradition and religion here. Is there anything that you would take from those religious traditions about the afterlife that you think could be explained in some way through science, or is that completely outside the realm of what is even possible to be studied?
I think it's almost impossible. I think there's a need to retain a bit of humility about these issues. Right? I think it's extremely unlikely that me as Anil Seth will continue after my brain stops working. And I think it's so hard to envisage an alternative to that, purely because I'm changing all the time anyway. And there's so much evidence that if you change part of the brain, the experience of self changes too. Now, this does not totally rule out that some kind of experience persists. But I just find that very hard to make sense of. We know that if you you'll know as a doctor, if you put someone under deep enough anesthesia, it's very different from a state of sleep. They basically cease to exist for a while. They're gone and they are back, and no time seems to have passed for them during that period. Was there some kind of background consciousness happening? Well, if there was, it's so different from anything that we experience at any stage of normal conscious life that it seems misleading to talk about it in terms of the afterlife at all. And I don't think there's any really good evidence for it. But of course, you might say, well, it's not the kind of thing that evidence is relevant for.
Sure, yeah. Going back to this definition of consciousness, because I think this is more so for me, perhaps some people get it quicker than me. You mentioned themes. So there's themes and there's overlap between what spiritual teachers or ancient philosophy has taught us. I understand so far that consciousness is self, and it's awareness, would you say, of the fact that I have thoughts and I have experiences and I experience the world through my various sensory inputs, be it visual, be it touch, etc. Are there any other themes outside of that, or have I got the sort of sense of self bit incorrect as well?
So I think the best way to think about consciousness is to strip it down to its very simplest manifestation. And as human beings, we tend to do the opposite. We tend to load onto this core concept things that are distinctively human, but which may not be necessary for consciousness in all its manifestations. The philosopher Thomas Nagel, I think he puts it for me in the best way. And he says very simply that for a conscious organism, there is something it feels like to be that organism.
Okay.
Not necessarily in an emotional way, just in the way that for you and me, it feels like something to be you and me. We're having experience. We're different from an object. For this table, it doesn't feel like anything for the table to be a table. Now, for many other animals, for a dog, for a cat, for a mouse, for a fish maybe, it feels like something to be that fish. But then for other things, it doesn't. And that's very, very simple. It's almost circular. You just say for something to be conscious, there's experiencing happening. But I like it because it's intuitive. You know, another way to put it is it's what goes away under sufficiently deep general anesthesia. And there is nothing it is like to be under really, really deep anesthesia, or dead, or not yet born. At least that's the parameters of the definition that I want to work with. And then on top of that, then you can start to say, okay, how does conscious experience play out for a relatively typical human being? Well, then there's the self. So we all experience being a self as well as just being the locus of experience. But that may not be necessary. Maybe some non-human animals, maybe a mouse has experiences, but doesn't experience being a mouse. Almost certainly doesn't have thoughts. You know, thoughts as we typically think of them require language, and even newborn human infants, as you'll soon discover, don't have language, right? So, but they're conscious, or at least we think so. There's an interesting question. How do we really know, of course?
That was going to be my next question.
But all of these things like thought, like language, like explicit sense of self, and this reflective aspect, which is central to practices like meditation, those may all be optional aspects of consciousness. But we treat them as definitional if we take the human way of being as an insight into consciousness as it has to be. And I think that's a mistake. And we've done this in humanity always. We take the human cases as definitional when it's really just one way in which things can play out. So
you've probably been asked this question before, because I get that animals can be conscious. Particularly, I have a little dog called Nutmeg, and I'm sure that she is conscious and she can manipulate me and my wife quite well. But outside of the realm of cats and dogs and pets and livestock, what about plants? Because plants, using some of those sort of features of what we just described as how we feel and how we communicate, they have their own language. They secrete different phytonicides into the atmosphere. They signal to trees far and far away, mushrooms in particular. There's a fascinating world of fungi and their networks that embed in the soil and how they communicate kilometers and kilometers away. Is there an argument to say that plants also have consciousness or a spark of life or are aware?
Well, I think they're alive, definitely. But it's another claim to say that everything that is alive is also conscious. I mean, some people will say that. I tend not to think that that's the case. Plants are really challenging. I want to say something nice about plants before I start dissing them. Yeah. They are so much more interesting than people often give them credit for.
Sure, yeah.
Because they operate at a different time scale. We as humans, we don't often see where the real action is, which can be under the ground rather than on the surface. This is especially so for trees and, as you say, like these beautifully complex mycelial networks of fungi. Rich behavior, some evidence of communication. Does any of this amount to consciousness? Is there something it is like to be a tree? My bet, and it is a bet because I think we have to be comfortable with uncertainty here, is that it's unlikely. And the reason I think that is that the only basis at the moment we have to infer whether something else is conscious, whether it's a tree or another animal or a computer, or a bunch of neurons in a dish in a lab, is based on what we know about those cases of consciousness where we're sure of, which is in human beings, primates, other mammals, let's say. And there's a few things. I mean, we know that consciousness can be pretty easy to lose, even in those cases where it exists. It also seems to be there for particular reasons. Like everything in biology is best understood through the lens of function. What's it for? Why did it evolve? Why are we conscious? How does it help us? And here I think there's accumulating evidence that consciousness is particularly useful for an organism when it combines many, many different sources of information about the world and the body in this sort of unified scene that can guide our behavior when we could respond in many different ways. We're very complex organisms. We have a lot of flexible potential to our behavior. Consciousness is really useful then. It's less useful when behavior can be more automatic, programmed, reflexive, and so on. So it's not clear that plants face the same challenges that animals faced that led to the evolution of consciousness. And then more prosaically, they don't have nervous systems.
Okay, yeah.
People sometimes say they do, but they don't really. They don't have the same kind of nervous systems that animals have. Maybe that's not necessary too, but I've yet to be convinced of a good explanation of how consciousness happens that doesn't rely on the operation of a nervous system.
Totally, yeah. I think if we're going to define a living thing as being conscious only if they have the presence of a nervous system, then by that definition, plants are out. They don't have that capacity. But pushing back slightly, I know this is completely above my pay grade here, but hopefully you'll find this enjoyable. Looking at the inputs that you just described there in terms of how we might react to visual inputs or through the lens of evolution, plants also have that sort of that drive to survive. They react to temperature. They react to different pests. Different soil quality, for example. There are a lot of influence that they are actually reacting to that has happened over millennia for the reasons why they can survive in so many different places. So by that definition, they are sort of responding, but they don't have a nervous system. So perhaps that's the qualifying information for consciousness itself.
It might be. And I think, again, I have to admit to humility here that we don't know. But saying we don't know doesn't mean we know nothing. It just means we can't be certain. And I'm also not satisfied with a definition that says, yes, you have to have a nervous system, otherwise you're not in the game. This just smacks of this arbitrariness that has darkened the human history of what we think of as conscious or not over centuries. Like, do you have language? If yes, you're okay. If not, you're not in the game.
Sure.
And we don't want to make that mistake again. So what's necessary is an explanation of why having a nervous system is the difference that makes a difference in this case.
Yeah.
And we're not quite there yet. And the strategy that I think is the only one we really have is this sort of slowly reaching out from where we can be relatively sure, pushing the boundaries, and recognizing uncertainty where it is. So, right now I think we're beginning to see common principles in the nervous systems of mammals that don't rely on language or things like that, that we can then start to ask interesting questions about animals who aren't mammals, insects, fishes, octopuses, creatures like this, birds, and begin to make more confident guesses about whether consciousness of some kind is present for these creatures.
Yeah.
And part of that is recognizing that if there is something it is like to be a sparrow, it's going to be very different from what it's like to be a human being. And this matters in terms of the ethical and moral decisions that we make, because it might not be that being conscious is what matters. It might be that the ability to suffer in particular ways is what matters for how we make our ethical and moral decisions. But as we sort of reach further and further out, I think we change the sort of the circumference of uncertainty. And right now, it's very hard to say anything sensible about plants. But if you're forced to say something, none of the, or very few of the signatures that we would take as indicative of consciousness are present in plants. But we should look for them. Now, we shouldn't just dismiss it because they're so different. And you're absolutely right that if you look for signs of behavioral complexity, they're most definitely there in plants, and to different degrees in different plants.
Within this sort of like new age field of health and well-being, you hear sort of these terms like, raise your consciousness, or if you do this, it will heighten one's awareness and consciousness. Does that actually have any sort of meaning to you? Do you recognize that there is a way to increase one's consciousness somewhat?
I think this is a great point, and I think it really highlights how this word is so slippery.
Sure,
we're all familiar with it. But we all use it in different ways.
Yeah.
Even within academia, even within, I go to an academic conference, and people will mean very different things by consciousness, which makes it very hard to make progress. I was at a meeting in Scotland a few weeks ago, which had a lot of people there from the Harvard Divinity School, and many other people as well. Some people talking about plants. So many different uses of the word.
Yeah.
What does it mean to raise our consciousness, to be in a higher state of consciousness? I think there are sensible ways, or ways that I find sensible, which is not necessarily the same thing. To think about that. One is, again, this ability to reflect on our own conscious experiences.
Okay.
Whether that's through meditative training or through research and philosophy, whatever. If we can step back from our flow of conscious experiences and recognize them more for what they are, rather than as this transparent window onto the way the world and the body is, I think that's a useful nuancing of this idea. But I think there are other meanings too. And another meaning is our recognition of things that matter beyond ourselves, taking into account what's happening in wider society or to the planet. These are all, I think, useful concepts, but they're really quite different.
Sure.
And it's easy to confuse them because sometimes people think that a crowd can be conscious, or that society itself can be conscious. Again, I think that's very unlikely. I think it's very hard to say anything sensible about that. But certainly the experience of being in a crowd, being in a collective, being aware of things beyond our own immediate personal concerns. I mean, that's very, very sensible. If you want to call that a higher state of consciousness, let's do so, but let's not confuse it with sort of what happens when you go under anesthesia, which is a lower state of consciousness.
Sure,
right?
Yeah.
You don't sort of go from anesthesia to normal waking consciousness and then out the other side to a higher state. We're talking about very different dimensions here.
For sure, yeah. So using that analogy, actually, if we can recognize that going under general anesthesia is low or no consciousness, is there, and us having a conversation today, is consciousness in its full form? We're engaged with only distractions. Is there a way to go beyond that? is there a way to, instead of being 100% now, go to 110% or whatever, however you want to describe it? Is that actually even possible, or is this all hyperbole that's conflated with a vibe or a feeling of togetherness when you're in a crowd, for example, which is not necessarily a high state of consciousness per se, but just like a warm, fuzzy feeling?
I think there's sometimes a bit of hyperbole about these things. But I also think the way we experience the world and the self is always changing and has the potential to change quite dramatically. And that's a potential worth leveraging. Every time we experience anything, we change the future trajectory of what we can experience. And if there's so many ways we can systematically change this, whether it's, as you were saying, changing what we eat. So our physiology changes, and the brain's perception and control of physiology is a big part of our emotional lives, a big part of what the self really is. So that's one way of changing the flow of our experiences. Meditation is another way. And then more transiently, people will take psychedelic drugs. And of course, that will shoot them straight into a very different way of experiencing the world and the self that can then be learned from. The many lessons people draw from having these kinds of experiences, some of which can be useful and some of which are less so.
Yeah. And within that sort of idea of becoming more self-aware, is that how what you would describe as more interoceptive? Or perhaps we could talk about interoception itself and what that actually means, and whether I'm conflating the two.
Yeah, I think that they're different things, but interoception is an interesting concept to dwell on for a minute, because it tends to be overlooked, but I think is very, very central. So when we think about the senses, they're the 5 classic senses, right? I always get them wrong. Vision, taste, sound. Vision, taste, touch, sound, smell.
Yeah.
But of course, we have many more than that. You'll know as a doctor, right? We have ones that are very obvious when you think about them. We have proprioception. We know where our body is without having to look at it or touch it. We have kinesthesia. We know how our body is moving, again, without having to look at it. We have vestibular sense of balance. But then we also have all these senses that come from the interior of the body. And this is broadly what is called interoception. So exteroception is all the senses that in general have to do with the outside world. And then interoception, all those senses that have to do with the interior of the body. If you think about it from the brain's perspective, brain is locked up here inside this bony vault of a skull. It doesn't have direct access either to what's out there in the world or to what's going on in the rest of the body. It has to rely on signals. And some of these signals come through the nervous system. That's interoception. And they'll tell the brain things about how the heart is doing, heartbeat variability, gastric tension, various things happening in the blood, in the visceral organs in general. There's a lot of traffic, of neuronal traffic that's happening purely within the body. That's interoception. And there's a long tradition, which I've sort of worked on a little bit myself, associating emotion primarily with interoception. What are emotions? What is an emotion? It can be very hard to pin that down, but I think a very useful way to pin it down is to say that an emotion is the brain's best guess of what's happening inside the body. Or a bit more accurately, when we experience an emotion, what we're experiencing is the flip side of the brain's predictions about the body that are trying to regulate, control the internal physiology so that we keep on living.
This is a really interesting concept for me because maybe this is slightly off topic, but ever since Google Maps came about, I've lived in London most of my life, and I was med school here. I remember being able to navigate London without looking at an A to Z, without looking up online and figuring out I need to go. I just know generally where I went to. And since Google Maps, I'm lost in London. I've completely sort of subverted or just outsourced that part of my brain to my phone. And where I'm going with this is I actually use tracking devices. So this ring, for example, will tell me my HRV. It will tell me how well I've slept the night before. And I feel like I've become a little bit more dependent on this, and I've become perhaps a little bit less interoceptive, a little bit less intuitive about how I'm actually feeling in the morning. And I wonder, the more and more wearables and other devices that definitely have their uses intrude on our life, perhaps we're becoming less interoceptive, and that intuition, that sort of ancient wisdom, is something that we should practice more of if we are trying to, be a more sort of conscious and aware person.
That's super interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way. I wonder. I mean, yeah, I resonate with your experience of how technology can lead us to outsourcing all kinds of things, right? I mean, I've done that too, and there's this concept from the philosophers Andy Clark and David Chalmers called the extended mind.
Okay.
The idea that the mind, not necessarily the conscious mind, but what we call the mind, this whole set of abilities that we have in virtue of having a brain, doesn't stop at the body. It involves the technologies we use, whether it's a piece of paper and a pen or now Google Maps. And we do outsource these things. So our mind becomes this integration between the technologies that we have and what's happening here. Now, I must admit, when I thought about things like wearables, I had thought that maybe these will help us better perceive our own bodies. Right? One of the problems here is very hard to measure this. It's very easy to measure things like visual perception because we can control it it's very hard to get a good sense of how accurate our brain's perceptions of the interior of the body are. But it's likely there are ways to estimate this, and there does seem to be a large amount of variation, and that variation has been associated with different psychiatric conditions without amazingly strong evidence yet, but it's an interesting hypothesis. I'd always thought that having objective information, let's say about heart rate, would provide some kind of feedback signal. So I'd be able to think, okay, that's sort of helping me tune my perception of the body from within. But of course, it could be the other way entirely.
Yeah.
If we use Google Maps to learn how to navigate London, maybe then we'd be able to learn more efficiently how to get around. But people don't use it that way. They use it in order not to think about that. So I think it's a really important question.
Yeah. I think context matters massively because, like you said, if you're using something like Duolingo to try to learn how to use a language, to learn a language, and that's your intention, that's different to relying on something like Google Translate to basically do the hard work for you. And I think what I've tried to start doing now is actually guessing what my HRV is going to be like in the morning before I look at the objective information. Obviously, there's debate about how accurate these things are, but before I get that objective information, just tuning in my body, like, how well do I think I've actually slept today? And does this match the number that I'm about to see on my screen? And maybe there is an experiment where you can sort of see how interoceptive people, or how intuitive people are to how they've slept, or their heart rate variability, or the heart rate in general. Like maybe there's a little experiment to be had there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I think in principle, that's exactly right. I mean, the first thing is, it could be that dependence in the sort of less proactive way. Just like, okay, how well did I sleep? I'll trust my app rather than my internal sense.
Yeah,
and maybe that makes people less able to. When you take that app away, maybe they're less able to report on aspects of their own physiology.
Yeah.
But then the second question is, well, what if you had two different ways of using it and you compared those? I think that's a great experiment in principle. The tough thing is like how you measure it. Again, very hard, but not impossible. But quite difficult.
Yeah. I think the intentionality of how we use devices, we should be a lot more aware of in general, actually, because I just feel like they can creep in and take over, and it's very easy to be led by your device rather than having objective control over it. It's one of the reasons why I'm very intentional about social media, because there are thousands of MIT trained engineers that are vying for my attention. I don't have a chance against those folks. So that's why I'm sort of like putting boundaries up quite consciously these days.
Yeah, that's very sensible. Yeah, we stand no chance against like the masses of extremely well-funded, very smart machine learning engineers who are trying to and successfully grabbing our attention and our attention. But it does strike me that, I mean, sometimes it may not be the wrong thing to do to sort of let that aspect of your mind go somewhere else. So now, would you use Google Maps to train yourself to navigate around London, or would you just say, actually, I don't need that anymore, and Google Maps does fine? I think I was in Japan last year in Tokyo, which is not a city I know well.
Yeah.
And so I was totally relying on Google Maps. I can't even read any of the directions. And my phone completely froze. It just turned into a brick. And I've never felt so vulnerable. It's like, what do I do? And I kept looking at my phone in order to figure out what do I do if my phone doesn't work, which was, of course, a very stupid thing to do. But it was so ingrained in me that I did it several times. Just, but where's the nearest Apple? My phone doesn't work. And I was thinking back to when I was maybe 18, 19, and I was traveling, backpacking around the world, way before we had any of this stuff. And it seemed to be fine. And I was thinking, what kind of person was I?
Totally.
That could manage without this helper, this piece of technology that told me where I was all the time. And that was really arresting because I just couldn't. I can manage it. Eventually, I had to find somebody else with a working phone and get them to help me.
Yeah, to help you. Yeah, it's weird when I think back of that because I remember backpacking at the same time. Like, I didn't have a smart device. I didn't have any of that stuff. And something my wife's been trying to do more recently is when she goes for a walk, she puts her phone away. And we both do this when we walk together. And just like you were mentioning, the number of times I instinctively reach for my phone when I want to take a picture of something or I want to look something up, like just because it is literally integrated already so much into our lives and our practices and our reflexes. Like it's, you can see it through the sort of skeptical lens of this is super, super intrusive and this is a bad thing. I think context matters in the intentionality in which we use these devices and being more intentional about them.
And isn't it interesting how if you're going to release a new medicine, a new pharmaceutical medicine out into society, you need to do so much testing.
Absolutely.
To understand what the consequences of it might be. But with technologies, you don't have to do any of this stuff, right? It's just not done. And it's only in hindsight that people start asking the questions, what has this done to us? In many cases, it's done great things. I'm not anti-technology at all. I think it's been hugely empowering, hugely liberating, and there's still so much potential. But it's been a little bit improvised, and that's certainly, I mean, the story of social media you're mentioning, and that's very, very salutary, isn't it? Because there, in hindsight, there was such a sort of naivety about its impact on society that now seems just, why would one ever think that it would turn out that way? It's clearly going to lead to echo chambers and polarization and all sorts of problems. Doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just, why did we have to do this worldwide global experiment in order to recognize that this might be a very likely outcome?
Yeah. Johan Hari, who's been on the podcast a couple of times, the first time he came on, we talked about his book Stolen Focus, which is a phenomenal book, and he interviews a lot of tech entrepreneurs and people who are at the forefront of this revolution following the invention of the iPhone. And he talks about this concept of attention stealing, but also how we're less likely to be in flow states. And this is something I wanted to ask you about, actually. How does consciousness relate to this flow state? And my sort of colloquial definition or understanding of flow is where I have absolute attention on writing the next chapter of my book, and I'm not distracted. I'm not thinking about what's going on social media or what's on the news and stuff. I get into a state where the words just sort of appear on the page. I'm sure you've had this at some,
Very rarely. I'm envious.
Yeah, but everyone's probably had that sort of like feeling at some point, whether it's writing, whether it's sport, whatever it might be, where they've had this sort of like this flow state. What do we understand about flow states, and does that relate to consciousness?
Yeah, it's a little out of my wheelhouse, though. We did have this focused meeting on flow a couple of years ago that was very interesting. It's a term. I think there's this Georgian psychologist who I think died not so long ago, Csikszentmihalyi, who came up with the term. The first thing to say about flow is that it pushes back against this idea of consciousness just being like higher or lower. Flow is not the same as a meditative state. It's not the same as a psychedelic state. It's not being asleep. So I like to think of consciousness as this very multidimensional thing. You can put it in many different ways, and you can't just put a number to it. And flow is pulling it in one particular direction. Where, as you say, the characteristics are immersion in a particular process, immersion in maybe towards a goal, the feeling that your attention is not distracted, perhaps a certain amount of ego dissolution as well. You become less reflective. Although that's arguable. There are some people that say in flow you actually have enhanced sort of ability to see what you're doing. You kind of step outside and observe yourself a bit more, and it can happen in many different contexts too. Yeah, maybe when writing, I love to have that experience. Certainly, I find when speaking sometimes. There's this sort of sense of like now you're in it. Changes in the perception of time. Does it dilate? Does it compress? But our experience of duration and flow can be different in flow. It seems to be something people aspire to be in this flow state. Because of its connotations of productivity, I think maybe that's a mistake. This sort of desire to be because it's productive may prevent us from getting there. But yeah, people doing math can get in the state as well. I don't know how you get there reliably, but it is, it's a rewarding place to be, and it does seem to be largely about attention. This is true.
It's interesting though, because even I fell into that trap actually of just making the connection between flow and productivity there. But I from my limited knowledge of flow, it doesn't necessarily need to be a goal orientated. It can be this, when you're running, for example, or when you're speaking, or just things appear to roll forward without any obstacles in your way, and you don't feel any friction. And I guess I was going to draw the connection between that potentially and psychedelics, and perhaps if there is, because people, again, to use the same sort of like new age vocabulary around psychedelics, getting yourself into a higher state of consciousness or becoming more aware. Is there any truth to that? Do we have any sort of studies that, I mean, we haven't even talked about like how we measure consciousness yet. Maybe that's something that we should tackle first before psychedelics.
Well, I think that's a good place to get into this actually. So there is a way to put a number to how conscious you are, even though I think in general that's really underestimating the richness and multi-dimensional nature of it. But one aspect of work we've been involved with in my group at Sussex and many others too is how do we measure, let's say, the depth of consciousness under anesthesia from sticking electrodes on people's brains, EEG, which is very commonly done. And there are many ways where we can do this, which are clinically useful. One of these ways is simply to measure kind of how random brain activity is. And if you do that, and there are many different algorithms you can apply, but basically it will come down to how random is brain activity. It turns out when you lose consciousness under anesthesia or in deep sleep, your brain becomes less random. It becomes more predictable in its dynamics over time. And then as consciousness reappears, when people come round from anesthesia or wake up, patterns in the brain become more diverse. There's just more variance, more variability in brain activity. probably it's not that the more random, the higher the consciousness. A completely random brain is unlikely to function at all. But within this space, this is what we see. And in a study a few years ago, this was a collaboration with Robin Carhart-Harris, who's one of the main people in the neuroscience of psychedelics. His group had recorded data from people under different psychedelics. And we wondered whether applying the same measure that we'd applied under sleep and anesthesia could be applied to data from people while they were on an LSD trip or a psilocybin trip. And we did this, and we found that the brain indeed became more random, still more random. So it went the other way. So here, it does look like, okay, you've got low consciousness when you're in anesthesia, you've got a very predictable brain, then you've got normal consciousness, and you've got some amount of randomness, and then you've got LSD, and you've got even more randomness.
Wow.
And so this got written up in some of the media as like evidence that psychedelics are a higher state of consciousness. And it was like, oh no, this is exactly not what we wanted the take-home message to be. And I think it's a very interesting observation that in the brain on psychedelics, there is more diversity. There is even less predictability. But I don't think it's a higher state of consciousness in the sense that it's like the opposite side of anesthesia.
Sure.
I think there's many other interesting things going on in psychedelics, and this extra randomness is just part of it.
Yeah, and this sort of, because we've spoken to Prof. Nutt on the pod as well, who I know has worked quite well with Carter Harris. This stripping away of sort of the ego is something that I've heard it told multiple times. And what we've been talking about is this awareness, this sort of sense of self and the perceptions and thoughts around that. Is there any evidence that you become, I mean, you just talked about the randomness here, but is there a sense that you become more aware of the fact that you are a conscious human being and that has sort of lasting effects thereafter? Or what's your opinion on that?
There are two ways people tend to interpret a psychedelic experience. Let's say of something like ego dissolution, which is this feeling that yourself is just dissolving. It's not really there anymore, the ego death in the more extreme cases. One response to these kinds of experiences is to take them as a more accurate perspective on how things really are. So people might say things like, I now know that consciousness is the primary way the universe manifests itself on the basis of the experiences I had on a DMT trip or something like that.
Sure.
The other response is to take it as evidence for the kinds of experiences that are available to a human brain, and to challenge some of our assumptions about how experience has to be. It's very easy to assume that experience has to involve an ego, has to involve a self. I think the latter interpretation makes more sense to me.
Okay.
Right? I don't think the content of a psychedelic experience is any better at revealing how things really are than normal experience, perhaps even less so. But what it is very good at is providing this evidence that experience can be many, many different ways, and we shouldn't take it for granted that it has to involve a self or a perspective or some of these other things. I think the best illustration of that is another kind of unusual experience, which is an out-of-body experience.
Yeah.
So these experiences have been reported for centuries, millennia, I think, in various contexts, spiritual contexts, and more recently in medical contexts, in the operating theatres, people often report out-of-body experiences.
Yeah.
And the characteristic of that is that you have the experience that your consciousness is no longer in your body. You may see your body from above or from a different perspective, or you may feel that you're just separate from your body and you're somewhere else. Again, there are two ways to interpret it. You could say, well, the fact that I've had an out-of-body experience is evidence that my consciousness can be separated from my brain and can actually go flying around. Or you could just say that having an out-of-body experience tells me that my normal experience of being within my body, behind my eyes, shouldn't be taken for granted. It's something the brain is doing. And again, I think the latter explanation is the more reasonable one. People have tried to find evidence for the former one, by hiding things on shelves in operating theatres and so on, and seeing whether they can be seen, which is just a bonkers experiment because like if your consciousness left your body, it doesn't even have any eyes, so how is it going to see anything? It's there's so many problems with that. So it seems much more reasonable and still very enlightening to take away the recognition that this first person perspective that is with us all almost all the time is not to be taken for granted as something the brain is doing. That gives, I think, a deeper insight into what the self is, what consciousness is. And the same would go for psychedelics. It's not giving us direct access to reality as it is, but it is revealing the things that we might assume are necessary about our experiences.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Like you were saying earlier, viewing our brains through the lens of evolution and how everything is sort of designed to protect us and to procreate and everything. Perhaps the way we interpret an experience like that gives us more meaning for life when we are back to normal, quote unquote, is something that is like a learnt behavior, something that is an understandable adaptation to being of low consciousness or like having a near-death experience in that way. Perhaps that's a rational way of thinking about cherishing one's life when you are back in your body and you're suddenly conscious again.
I think that's exactly right. I think one of the main lessons certainly that I've taken from studying this for a long time, and this wasn't an intention, but it makes you take things less for granted. Yeah, it really does. It's so easy just to take our consciousness for granted. We wake up in the morning, open our eyes, and there it is. There's the world, and here's the self again, and back to my routine. That is such a remarkable phenomenon. The fact that there is anything it is like to be you, to be me, to have the experience of the world, the taste of coffee, even if it's a difficult emotion, the fact that it's there is extremely remarkable. And I think this is not, there's nothing revolutionary about this. People often say that surviving an illness or emerging from a challenging situation, one way to deal with that is to allow a sense of gratitude.
Yeah.
And that's certainly true when it comes to consciousness as well. It's just absolutely remarkable that this collection of atoms, molecules, chemicals is able somehow to be the source of or identical with an experience, a self.
Do you have a gratitude practice yourself? I know you don't have a meditation practice, but perhaps gratefulness exercises?
Yes, but it's not very systematic again.
Sure.
I think it's been very sporadic. A couple of years ago, what are we now, 2020? Yeah, 2.5 years ago, I came down with long COVID. Right. I had a COVID infection, and I've had illnesses before, but nothing that was ever that kind of chronic and ongoing. And that was very challenging for me. It still is in a way, and actually caused me to think about a lot of the other things we've been talking about, like the microbiome, the gut, nutrition, the immune system, a very important part of what the self is. I mean, the immune system is all about differentiating self from non-self. And it's not something I'd paid that much attention to before, but I'm sure it's part of the story. But just the experience of being so affected for months and months by this condition, did lead me to think about what's still there and what I can still be grateful for. And that was an important part of coping with it.
Yeah, absolutely. We've done some episodes on COVID, actually. I'll make sure to send them to you afterwards. And that idea of our immune system recognizing self from non-self is something that I'm acutely aware of, as a medical doctor, and something that we obviously have an interest here, looking at nutrition. But I haven't really thought of that as sort of almost being part of what it is to be me.
I think it's a very open question. I mean, we certainly know that sort of immune-related processes affect mental states.
Yeah.
There's a wonderful book by Ed Bullmore called The Inflamed Brain. I think it's called that.
The Inflamed Mind.
The Inflamed Mind.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, there it is.
Yeah.
Which is this idea about depression, very different from the sort of prevailing ideas of depression as being an imbalance or a lack of serotonin in the brain. These very chemistry-based approaches to something that is much more about inflammation. That neuroinflammation might be the core or a core mechanism for depression. I found it pretty convincing. So there's that, and certainly I think in these chronic conditions like long COVID and so on, there seems to be this systematic, persisting inflammation, which it really does seem to have a direct or fairly close relationship to one's emotional state. But there's really very little work on, let's say, the immune system and the psychology of being a self.
Yeah.
And I think that's a very exciting area.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'd love to see some collaboration between you and a microbiologist, looking at sort of how inflammation or how the state of one's gut can influence, their sense of self, their sense of consciousness.
There is work going on in this area by other people. There's a French researcher called Catherine Talon-Baudry who's looking quite a lot at gut-brain interactions. I'm not sure if she's doing microbiome stuff, but there's a lot of interest there too.
Yeah.
I mean, one thing about the gut is there are a lot of neurons down there. There are a lot of brain cells in the gut.
Yeah.
And some people call it the mini brain, right? I mean, it's organized very differently. There are a lot of serotonin neurons down there, generate a lot of this chemical that is associated with all kinds of brain function. And also there seems to be electrical coupling too. So, if you put electrodes on your head, you measure this thing called the electroencephalogram, the EEG. And the rhythms tend to be quite fast, maybe 10 hertz or something like that, 10 times per second, the alpha rhythm. But you can do the same thing on the gut, and it's the electrogastrogram. And you can get these electric rhythms that you can see generated by muscle contractions often, but perhaps also some neural activity in the gut. And there's some research which is showing that these things are actually coupled, that there is this, there's a constraint on the activity of the gut in terms of its electrical activity that is really tightly coupled with the brain. So this idea that the gut and the brain speak to each other, I think is substantiated in many ways.
Absolutely. Yeah. We're constantly going on about the gut-brain axis. And there's a book actually I'll recommend by Dr. James Kinross. He's a GI surgeon. we recently had a chat with him. He's written a book called Dark Matter, and it's one of the best books I think I've read on the microbiota, because he obviously brings his clinical experience, but his experience as a microbiome researcher as well in the lab. And I think that sort of academic slant of everything is just fascinating. And he talks about neuropod cells and how we taste with our gut as well, and how that can actually have an impact on our nutrient-seeking behavior, what we prefer, how that affects appetite, etc. So there's a whole fascinating world there. I want to turn our attention from one sort of super intelligent system, our gut, to artificial intelligence, and this sort of question that I'm sure, again, you've been asked tons of times about whether AI or machines can ever become conscious, sentient beings. And I know in your TED talk, you talked about how the idea of just something being super, super intelligent doesn't necessarily equate to being conscious. But I guess over the last year and a half, I certainly wasn't expecting to be that blown away by what we have today with all these different AI and chat systems. Perhaps it was on your radio, I'm not too sure, but I'm just super impressed at like what I'm seeing so far. And it does beg the question, even in my mind, that whether these could be conscious at one point. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
It's very natural to ask those kinds of questions, right? I mean, when I gave the TED Talk, that was 2017. Things have changed enormously since then. I was not imagining the kinds of language models and so on that we have today. I don't think anyone was really. It's taken, one of the surprising things is how surprising AI has been to people who develop this stuff. I mean, it's taken everybody by surprise. But my view about whether AI could be conscious, that is, does it feel like something to be ChatGPT? I still think this is very unlikely. And I think our tendency to think that it is likely is more a reflection of our psychological biases than a likelihood about what's actually going on. We talked about plants earlier and non-human animals, and how do we make inferences, best guesses about whether something is conscious or not? You know, there is, of course, figuring out, well, how much of what we know is necessary for consciousness in humans and animals is there in AI. The other part of the story, though, is recognizing the influence of our own biases. And we as human beings, we tend to mix together three different kinds of bias. We're very anthropocentric, which is to say we see the world through the lens of human values. We're also very human exceptionalist, typically. You know, we tend to think of ourselves as superior to and on the top of everything else, whether it's the tree of life or something else. And we are distinctive. You know, things like language really do seem to set us apart from most other living creatures. But we tend to couple these things together. You know, we think we're super intelligent, you know, compared to other animals, and we know we're conscious, so we tend to associate the two together and just sort of assume that as something gets more intelligent in a human-like way, then consciousness will come along for the ride. But I think that's just our bias. And the third one is anthropomorphism. You know, we tend to project human-like qualities into things on the basis of what might be superficial similarities. And here again, language is key, right? If something speaks to us, we tend to project everything into it. Like, okay, it's intelligent, it's got a mind, and also it might be conscious. And it's really hard not to do that. I mean, we might be in a similar position with these visual illusions, right? We might be unable to resist attributing consciousness to things like language models, even if we believe they're not conscious. So we might suffer from cognitively impenetrable illusions of consciousness in AI. So if you bracket out, if you try and just recognize the influence of our biases, even if we can't think our way out of them, just knowing they're there is useful. Then we have to ask, okay, so really, what's the evidence that AI systems could be conscious? And here views really differ. And I think the actual evidence is pretty weak. You know, there's so many differences between AI systems and brains. I mean, even AI is part of the problem here. The term AI, if it was called the field of applied statistics, you know, no one would be thinking the same things. And also, you know, we don't worry. AI is not just language models, right? It's all kinds of other things. DeepMind here in London, these beautiful AI applications in things like drug discovery and materials design. No one thinks these systems are conscious. But you know, they're very similar in many ways to ChatGPT. But I think the simplest challenge is to put it like this, right? Some things, if you run them on a computer, they actually are the thing. Like a computer that plays chess actually plays chess. You know, chess is something that's defined in terms of a set of rules and you know, how things operate according to those sets of rules. But some things, if you run them on a computer, you don't actually produce that thing. So if you have a computer simulation of a weather system, it's just a simulation. No one's confused about that. No one expects it to actually rain inside
Yeah.
the Met Office's massive simulation of the British weather. So is consciousness more like chess, or is it more like the weather? People tend to think it's more like chess, that computation, information processing, these terms is very, very common. We tend to think that, well, obviously that's what consciousness is. It's some kind of computation. It's some kind of information processing. That might be right, but it is one huge assumption.
Yeah.
It may well be that consciousness is just not the kind of thing that a computer could in principle have, however you program it. And that in fact, consciousness may be much more of a biological property, something much more like digestion or metabolism. Sure, you can simulate metabolism on a computer, but to actually have it, you need the right kind of chemistry. My intuition is that that's the case for consciousness, but it's very hard to make that a watertight argument. And I don't know that that's the case, but what I am confident in is people often run with this assumption rather unexamined. And that's partly because we have this metaphor of the brain as a computer. That's a good metaphor, but it's just a metaphor. And we always go wrong when we confuse a metaphor with the thing itself, when we mistake the map for the territory.
Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, if I can be fooled, going back to the start of our conversation, by visual illusions, I can imagine being easily fooled and my mind running with the idea that the computer that I'm interfacing with via my laptop keyboard is actually real, is actually speaking to me, particularly if you put voice on that, actually.
Yeah.
So, going towards those three biases that you just mentioned, put a Siri voice on top of ChatGPT and getting me to have a conversation with it, it simulates me having a conversation with a human. So it's easy to conflate that with genuine intelligence, artificial general intelligence, I think it's referred to as. Whereas actually it's just a very good computer that won't ever be conscious itself.
That's right. But again, we don't want to confuse AI or even artificial general intelligence with consciousness.
Gotcha.
Intelligence. Yeah. So AGI, as this is the sort of buzzword in the industry, right? AGI is an AI system that has the intelligence capabilities either of or more than a typical human being.
Yeah.
Now that itself is a bit of an illusion. Like, there's no stable point where this will happen. AI systems are already much better than us at many things.
Yeah.
So we will never have sort of this AGI equivalence.
Sure.
But wherever we go on the spectrum of intelligence, none of that means that consciousness is part of the story too. Sure. It might be, it might not be.
Yeah.
But I think this topic really matters because a lot of the debate in this area mixes up these things, and it really matters because AI is everywhere. We're not going to be able to avoid it, just in the same way we're now completely dependent on our cell phones. Yeah. And there's one question which I think is very difficult to answer. I think it's whether AI will actually be conscious. I think my intuition is that this is not going to happen, but we don't really know. It depends on your theory. It depends on your philosophy. But the other question is, what should we do as a society when we are in a situation interacting with systems that we can't help feeling are conscious? And that's already here, or almost already here. As you said, you couple a language model with some video and audio, with a deep fake and generative audio.
Yeah.
It's going to be very, very hard for our puny human minds to be able to discern whether the person you're talking to on video is actually a real person or not.
Yeah.
I mean, now you can still catch them out, but that's going to change.
It's going to change, yeah.
And this is really problematic. We have to think very carefully about, do we want technologies like that? How do we regulate them? How should we interact with them? Just as we might offload some of our memory or our navigational competence to an iPhone, what are we going to offload if we have, let's say, a digital twin. Now, and I really worry about some of the, I think, extraordinary psychological naivety that you see in some applications. So there's companies I've seen who want to do things like digitally reanimate a dead relative.
Oh yeah, I've heard about those.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Like train a language model on whatever somebody has said.
Yeah.
And for all of us now, there's more than enough training data. I mean, especially you, you've been doing so many podcasts. Your digital reincarnation will sound exactly like you in a podcast studio, maybe not like you actually at home.
Yeah.
But you train a model on the data, and there's enough video as well. And then you can digitally reincarnate a dead relative. Why would we want to do this? You might think, oh, that's great. I can still talk to, I still dream of my father who died 11 years ago, and this is great.
Yeah.
But I think if he were there in digital form,
100%.
oh my God, I mean, the whole process of grief, of moving on, would be so inhibited.
Yeah.
Plus, there's a huge threat of manipulation.
Absolutely.
So who is deciding what my digitally reincarnated father would say when I ask him for investment advice?
Yeah.
Maybe it's not what he would actually say.
Yeah.
Maybe it's what some machine learning company is tuning him to say. So these are huge issues, and these are the present, the here and now, and we get distracted when we focus on these sci-fi scenarios of Terminator robots and conscious artificial intelligence. Now, I think we need to really understand what's happening now and in the next few years, and make sure we do things in a way that's complementary to our society, to our psychologies, and just not going in there like a bull in a china shop.
Absolutely. I think, to your point, focusing on our psychological weak points is probably something that we should be paying more attention to, rather than the sort of like Terminator scenarios. Because, I mean, just looking at companies like Meta, for example, and how whether external governments or whether internal companies are manipulating what I see on my home screen is influencing my political persuasion or my thoughts about society in general in the UK, Brexit, for example, et cetera, et cetera. We already know that this is played out. And so if you apply an even more sophisticated AI model on top of that, you can just see how clearly our psychological weak spots could be exploited.
Yeah, and I think another aspect of this, which has been widely commented on, is that there's a sort of meta effect, which is if we know that it's hard to tell the difference between what is real and what is machine generated, then our general trust in anything is reduced, and we just think, well, I don't trust what any news source says. I don't trust what any objective or approximately objective report is. And that's very problematic, because we rely on a certain amount of consensus.
Yeah.
Just in the same way, if we're driving around, we just rely on the fact that people know that they should drive on one side of the road and not the other. It's not, if it was anything goes, it wouldn't work. Exactly the same thing applies here. If we don't have a solid consensus on things, at least roughly on what's going on, which allows for massive differences of opinion. But there has to be some amount of consensus. Otherwise, we'll just have the story of people driving on whatever side of the road writ large. And you and I have probably both been in India. It is not great.
This actually sort of comes back to this idea of controlled hallucinations that I think you spoke about both in your book and in your TED Talk, and how our perception are essentially hallucinations or visual illusions that we agree on. Have I got that right?
Say that again.
So our perception are illusions or hallucinations that we all agree on. So we agree in large that this is a table, this is beige, we're speaking into a microphone, this is something that we all recognize in this room. And hallucinations in the psychiatric context are uncontrolled hallucinations. Have I got that right?
Sort of. I mean,
Okay.
it's
I should have just got you to explain it.
But this is the problem, that it's where language struggles.
Yeah.
That we don't have the perfect words to describe what's going on, and all the words that one might choose have baggage, have connotations.
Yeah.
So I still am attracted to this idea of describing perception as a kind of controlled hallucination.
Okay.
And the reason I think this is useful is because when most people hear hallucination, what comes to mind is an experience that's internally generated, right? Not something that's a direct, accurate reflection of what's going on, but something that's coming from within. And I think all of our experiences are like that. They are all the brain's predictions, best guesses of what's going on, that come from more this inside-out direction rather than the outside-in, reading out the world direction. But the qualifier controlled is critical here.
Okay.
So our hallucinations are controlled when they're reined in, calibrated by sensory signals that come from the world, which is why you and I both agree there's a table here. They're tuned to the world, but they don't reveal the world directly as it is. So perception is not arbitrary. It's generally useful, generally reliable, but we don't see things as they are. We see them as we are, or as it's useful for our brain to do so, as evolution has decided it's useful. And then hallucination, as it appears in a more clinical, medical, psychiatric context, you can think of that as uncontrolled perception. So we still have this dance of predictions going from the inside out and sensory signals coming from the outside in. But now the balance and the dance has gone awry a little bit, and the brain's predictions lose their grip on the world as it is. So people start perceiving things that are not there, or that other people don't. But instead of hallucination being a completely different phenomenon, I think it's more accurate to say they're just different points on this scale. Every experience we have is this balance between the brain's predictions and what sensory signals are telling the brain. And you can fall on this scale in many different ways, in many different states. I mean, if we go outside now, maybe there's some clouds and we might see faces in clouds. That's a kind of hallucination. So, it's called pareidolia in the Greek. But it's not really a fully fledged hallucination. But I think it reveals that the brain is always interpreting. It's always trying to make sense of sensory information, which is fundamentally ambiguous.
Yeah. And I guess, riffing off that idea of pareidolia, if I'm in a happy state, let's say, I might be more inclined to see fluffy images or something that evokes a positive feeling in a random mixture of clouds than if I'm in a negative state. And perhaps, going back to the idea of mindfulness and meditation and trying to have a positive affect in general, perhaps that does influence in a significant way my perception of the world. And this is what we should be all striving for, and putting ourselves in intentional environments to create that sort of more positive experience.
Yeah, I think the first step is definitely this recognition that there can be an interaction. There's a Israeli researcher, Moshe Bar, who pioneered a lot of this stuff, showing that our emotional responses and our, let's say, visual experiences are pretty, they influence each other. And they do this in very measurable ways. And to me, this makes sense, because my overall story about how the brain works and how to understand consciousness is really that this brain is fundamentally this prediction machine that evolves and develops to control and regulate the body. So interoception, in the sense, comes first. Turns out that being able to make predictions and update these predictions is a very, very good way to implement control. Once you can predict something, you can control it. And that only later these same mechanisms of prediction were sort of extended to deal with the outside world through vision, hearing, and so on. That's a very sort of simple story. But it just means that these are all grounded on the same thing. There's this fundamental principle of brain operation about regulating the body, keeping the body in the physiological states that it expects to be in. And everything is built on that. So then it's no surprise that there are deep interactions between how we visually experience something and our emotions. But this is a relatively new perspective, because for a long time psychology tended to put things in boxes. You've got reason here, you've got vision here, you've got memory here, and we often try to separate these systems rather than thinking of them as different expressions of the same underlying principle.
Yeah. I think you've really widened my understanding of consciousness as being more thematic and more sort of all-encompassing rather than just one thing, and sort of clarified the language around consciousness. I'm really intrigued as to, this might seem like a bit of a left field question, but what you do in your lab. I think a lot of people listen to this, like, this is great, consciousness, I get it, I understand that it's an important subject matter that demands attention, but what does your day-to-day actually look like?
It changes. I mean, one of the great privileges, I think, of working in this area is I had this fear about becoming an academic.
Okay.
That, when you're at school, you do, 10 subjects at GCSE, and then 3 or 4 A levels, and then 1 subject at university. And I thought, by the time I'm I'm a professor, I'm going to know everything about something that nobody else cares about. And there was just this end point of specializing. I was legitimately worried about this.
Yeah.
One of the joys of researching consciousness is that it's the exact opposite. There was this bottleneck, I think, doing the PhD when you really focus. But consciousness, and then many other things, really, the richness is in the interdisciplinarity. In my lab, depends quite when you visit, depends on what funding I've got at any particular point.
Sure.
But we've had mathematicians and physicists and psychiatrists and psychologists and philosophers and neuroscientists. I've worked with artists and theater designers and filmmakers and storytellers, and the breadth of the perspective and techniques and methods has just been a joy. So a typical day might be I'm working with a long-time postdoctoral researcher, good friend of mine, Lionel Barnett. We work on mathematical measures of emergence. How do we say, like, we've got all these neurons in the brain, how do we say when they're doing something that's more than the sum of the parts? In the same way that you see a flock of birds, sometimes the flock seems to have an autonomy and identity of its own. So how do we develop mathematical measures that characterize that? And maybe that's going to be a useful technique in figuring out what's happening when the brain is in a conscious state or not. So there's that. And then another experiment, which I'm very excited about at the moment, is more directly related to this controlled hallucination idea.
Okay.
So we've discussed informally that, we might experience different things because we might have different emotional states. Fundamentally, we all have different brains. So even if we're in the same shared reality, like you and I are now, who's to say that you're experiencing the color of these books behind me in the same way that I am when I look at them? Who's to say we're experiencing time passing at the same rate? I think we really underestimate this inner diversity. And so we have this experiment in collaboration with philosopher Fiona McPherson at Glasgow and Collective Act, who are this brilliant organization, to look at perceptual diversity, to understand, actually get some data on questions like, if I am, for instance, if I see this illusion in a particular way, am I more likely to see a face in a cloud than not? How do we have perceptual personalities? And people talk a lot about neurodiversity. And it's a very important topic, but it's tended to have become associated with specific conditions, like autism and ADHD. And ironically, I think this has reinforced the assumption that if you're not neurodivergent, then you're neurotypical and you see things as they are. I think this is just really unfortunate, unintentional. I mean, neurodiversity was always supposed to apply to everyone. But that's why I prefer this term perceptual diversity, because it doesn't have that baggage. And I really want to understand how different our experiences are, even when those differences might not normally surface.
Yeah.
We use the same words. And so that's an experiment that's going on. And I don't know, I don't know what we'll find.
Sure.
We've got about 40,000 people have done several hours of experiment each. So it's a massive data set.
That's huge.
And we collected it over the course of a year and a half. So it's going to be a unique resource that we'll make available to the whole research community. And it might have a lot of clinical application as well. It might turn out that we want to see these spectra as a whole, not just look at the extremes, but look at the whole distribution.
Sure.
And figure out what correlates with what, why that might be. And just as an appreciation of diversity has been socially enriching when it comes to differences in skin color and height and body shape and so on, I really think the same thing can be true when we have a deeper appreciation of the diversity that's within us all.
Yeah. My bias being a clinician is always to think of, okay, this is great, and I'd love more data and information to better educate people on how they can lead healthier, happier lives. And so within that data set, if we understand the differences between perceptual diversity and perhaps what the associations are with the type of information they're drawn to, or how they learn things in a particular way, or maybe there's random associations that we've got we had no prior knowledge of like taste differential, what kind of cuisines you're more likely to be attracted to, putting my nutrition hat on. So that kind of stuff I think is just super interesting, with a clinical sort of slant.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of starting points likely to come out of this. There's not many endpoints. We don't know anything about taste, for instance, because we were restricted to doing things people could do on a computer at home. So it's mainly about vision and hearing and some more general questionnaires. But it's going to provide a lot of starting points. A problem for this kind of thing, of course, when you've got a vast amount of data, you will always find something.
Yeah.
So what I expect will happen is we'll use this to sort of seed lots of little follow-up studies that might look into relationships that emerge from the data, but each of those needs to be tested by itself. But I think there will be a lot of clinical angles. One other thing we want to look at, for instance, an extension of this is we want to look at differences over age. We've already got people in their 70s and 80s who have done this. And so we can look at how perception changes in the different decades of life.
Yeah.
And then in a collaboration with Andrew Budson and other colleagues in the US, this is something that doesn't exist yet, but this is a goal, is we want to see if we can identify like perceptual signatures of cognitive impairment, early stages of dementia, and so on. And that could have significant clinical impact too, both in diagnosis, but perhaps also in sort of coping strategies, cognitive training strategies, and so on.
Yeah, even gender differences. I mean, we're spending a lot of time at the moment looking at menopause as a health goal in the Doctor's Kitchen app. And I've had multiple conversations with menopause experts and stuff. And, just the new knowledge that I have about how fluctuations in cholesterol arise at different times of the month in a person who is menstruating, let alone post-menopausal, where you have a vastly different hormonal picture that's having an influence in the brain, and the increased likelihood of things like dementia and increased likelihood of metabolic disease as well. That would be fascinating to know about, if there is differences in terms of perception.
Yeah.
And, there's just so many questions. It's just a fascinating field to be part of. I want to bring this conversation to a close. I'm aware that we've been going for almost 2 hours. We have sort of our audience, as you know, is nutrition, healthy lifestyle focused. Is there anything in your research that you think that stands out as a learning point that has perhaps influenced the way you live, or perhaps you've seen has influenced how other people have lived to lead a healthier, happier life, in the knowledge of how our brains are these sort of prediction machines, and how we can easily be fooled, or we can perceive things differently as a result of the inputs day to day.
I think for me, it comes down to this mantra-like thing that how things seem is not how things are.
Okay.
It's a very easy thing to say, but the study of how consciousness works, how perception works, just allows that basic statement to take root and to really impact everyday life.
Uh-huh.
So when I walk around the world, there is often part of me that's reflecting on how the experience I'm having is just indirectly related to what's going on, how the experience of self that seems to be at the center of this experience is itself a kind of construction. That opens up a bit of space. It's a good place to finish because it's sort of where we started. I think if we can open a bit of space between how things seem in our immediate experience and how things might actually be, we gain some power, we gain some autonomy, some motivation to alter things, because there's an indirectness, there's space to work with. I think that can be very, very helpful.
Yeah. I think you're probably more in a meditative state than you probably give yourself credit for. If you're walking around the world and you're all, like being conscious of these sort of inputs and stuff, it sounds like you're in a calm, meditative, grateful state.
I feel very distracted very, very often, but I'm hoping there might be in the Venn diagram of all these different things, maybe there's a bit of useful overlap. Maybe.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think that sense of self and actually that understanding of who I am. It's funny. I was having a chat with my one of my best friends, and he's someone who struggles to exercise regularly, and I'm someone who exercises. I'm pretty strict and disciplined in my routine, but I was trying to figure out, because he's one of those stop starters. Like, he'll start exercising and then he'll stop because life gets in the way or whatever. I was trying to figure out, like, I have similar sort of pools in my time, new pools in my time with a baby on the way, but I think it's because I identify as someone who exercises every day, if not, most days. My sense of self is very much tied to my exercise regime and now my meditation regime. And I wonder if that holds true in some way for other people. If you could sort of mold that sense of who you are and what activities you do on a day-to-day basis, maybe that has an impact on your motivation and the consistency piece for healthy living that so many people struggle with.
I think that's exactly right. I think, and it fits beautifully into this overall story we've been exploring today, which is that all our ways of perceiving, experiencing things depend not only on the data that the brain gets, but on its priors, on its beliefs about the way things are. And we have these beliefs about the self. I'm this kind of person. And they're all predicated on there being like a stable essence of you or me. And by relaxing some of those beliefs, now psychedelics can do this too in a very much rapid way, right? And I don't know, it really depends on what you do after, whether it's useful. But sure, if we can change the sort of the brain's priors about what kind of self is going on here, then yeah, that may be necessary for change. It certainly may facilitate change in very useful ways. But to allow that to happen, it can help to have yet a higher order belief, which is that identity is itself flexible. Identity is a process. It's not a thing.
Yeah.
Just last week, I was back visiting my mother, and I found some diaries of me at the age of 6 and at the age of 9. And it's just crazy, right? I mean, it's in some sense, it's the same person.
Yeah.
But, reading, I hadn't seen these for, I don't know, 40 years or something like that.
Yeah.
It's so hard to reconcile reading those diaries with the identity that I feel that I am now. If we look for this balance, of course, if you throw everything to the wind and say, well, there is no, there's no stability at all to what it is to be me, I think that could also lead to problems.
Yeah.
I think the key, isn't it? This will take us right back to spiritual lessons and so on. And what's the right metaphor for thinking of the self? Maybe it's some kind of process, something like a flock of birds. That it has an existence, has an impact, but it's always changing. It's always made up of different birds. It's always changing shape. It's never the same flock. I mean, the philosopher, I forget which, sadly, but there's the classic philosophical idea that no man can step into the same river twice because it's not the same river and he's not the same man. And it's the second part of that that's absolutely key.
Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, this has been such an enlightening conversation. Appreciate you, Anil, coming on and sharing your wisdom. This is brilliant.
Oh, thanks very much for inviting me up here. It's been a real pleasure to you. Thanks so much.
This is brilliant. If you want to lower your risk of dementia, I've done a video right here that's all about food swaps that you can action today that will massively lower your risk of dementia. Check it out right there.